Rain had been falling over the Montana foothills for 2 days straight when Ruth Calloway first saw the man stumbling along the fence line at the edge of her family's land, and she knew before she'd even gotten a clear look at his face that he was running from something. Because no man crossed open country in that kind of weather unless the alternative behind him was worse than the storm ahead. She had gone out to check on a heifer that had wandered from the herd. Lantern in one hand and rifle slung over her shoulder out of the plain good sense a woman living mostly alone learned to carry with her. And it was the rifle she raised first when the stranger's shape resolved itself out of the gray sheets of rain, before she saw how badly he was favoring his left side. Before she saw the dark stain spreading through his shirt that the rain hadn't yet washed clean. Before she saw, most tellingly of all, the way his eyes went not to her face but to the road behind her, checking, even in his condition, whether she'd come alone or brought trouble with her. She lowered the rifle only slightly and asked him, in the plain voice of a woman who had learned not to waste words on people who might not live long enough to hear the rest of them, what had happened to him and who was looking for him. And he told her, between breaths that clearly cost him something, that his name was Nathaniel Cole, that he'd been shot 2 days back by men who worked for a cattle baron named Everett Voss, and that the charge against him, cattle rustling, though he swore on. Whatever she'd let him swear on that it was a lie built to cover Voss's own theft of another rancher's herd. Carried a rope at the end of it in 3 counties, whether or not a judge ever bothered to hear his side. Ruth had heard Everett Voss's name enough times in town to know it wasn't spoken kindly by anyone who didn't work directly for him. And she had heard enough, too, about the convenient way men who crossed Voss tended to end up either in irons or in the ground, that she found herself believing the stranger's account before she'd had time to decide whether believing him was wise. She got him into the barn rather than the house, both because a wounded fugitive was not something she wanted her younger brother Daniel to wake up and discover before she'd had a chance to think it through, and because the barn offered enough darkness and enough distance from the road that a search party riding past at night might not think to look there. She dug the bullet out of his side by lantern light with a knife she'd boiled in the kitchen in hands that shook only slightly, and Nathaniel Cole gritted through it without much sound beyond his breath going ragged, watching her face the entire time with an expression she couldn't quite place until later, when she understood it as the look of a man unaccustomed to being helped by anyone and unsure what to do with the sensation. When it was done and the wound was packed and bound as well as her limited skill allowed, she asked him the question that had been sitting behind her teeth since she'd first seen him stumbling along her fence line, whether he had anywhere else to go, any family, any town where he might disappear and start again once he'd healed enough to ride. He told her no, plainly, without self-pity, the way a man states a fact he made peace with a long time ago. His parents were dead. His brother had been killed in the same range war that had first put him crosswise with Voss's operation, and every town within riding distance had already heard Voss's version of events before Nathaniel himself ever arrived to offer his own. He said it the way a man might describe whether he could do nothing about, and Ruth, crouched beside him in the lantern light with blood still under her fingernails, found something in that flat, resigned honesty that struck her harder than any plea for help would have. She told him he could stay in the barn until he'd healed, and after that they would see, and she made him understand, in the same plain voice she used for everything, that this was not charity offered lightly nor a decision she expected to regret discussing with him further at that hour. Nathaniel Cole, who had spent the better part of 2 years running from one county to the next with nothing waiting for him at the end of any road, looked at her for a long moment in that barn with the rain still hammering the roof above them, and said only that he didn't understand why a woman with a rifle and a brother to protect would risk either on a stranger who might well bring Voss's men down on her own house. And Ruth answered that she had asked God for a reason more useful than luck to explain why she'd walked out to check on that heifer at exactly the hour a wounded man happened to be stumbling along her fence, and that until she got a better one, she intended to act on the assumption that some things were simply meant to be done, whether or not they were wise. The weeks that followed asked more of Ruth Calloway than she had expected when she first made that decision in the barn. She was 24 years old and had run the ranch largely on her own since her father's death 2 winters back, with only Daniel, 14 and eager but not yet grown into real usefulness, to help her manage cattle, fences, and the endless small emergencies of a working ranch. Hiding a wounded fugitive added a layer of vigilance to every day that wore at her in ways she hadn't fully accounted for. Watching the road more carefully than usual, keeping Daniel occupied elsewhere during the hours she brought food and fresh dressings out to the barn, listening for hoofbeats that didn't belong to anyone she knew. But Nathaniel healed steadily, and as he did, he began finding small ways to make himself useful despite her insistence that he rest. Mending a section of fence from where he could work without being seen from the road, fixing a hinge on the barn door that had hung crooked since her father's time, teaching Daniel, in low careful conversations that Ruth pretended not to notice, some trick of roping that the boy had been failing to master on his own. It was in watching this, watching a hunted man, with every reason to keep himself small and unnoticed, instead choosing quietly and repeatedly to make her family's life easier, that Ruth began to understand something about him that his flat account of his own prospects hadn't conveyed, which was that Nathaniel Cole was a man who had been given almost nothing by the world and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, kept his decency intact anyway. Word came to town, as it inevitably would, that Everett Voss's men were still combing the county for the fugitive who'd escaped their ambush. And Ruth heard this news secondhand from a neighbor woman at the general store, delivered with the particular relish some people reserve for tragedy that hasn't touched them personally. She rode home faster than the errand strictly required, and found Nathaniel in the barn exactly where she'd left him, and told him what she'd heard, and watched him take the news the way he took everything, with a quiet stillness that she was beginning to recognize not as indifference but as a kind of armor a man built when he'd learned that panic solved nothing and cost everything. He told her that he should move on before he brought Voss's men down on her land, that he'd stayed longer than he should have already, that a woman raising a brother alone couldn't afford the risk his presence represented, however grateful he was for what she'd done. Ruth found herself, in that moment, arguing against her own earlier caution with a fervor that surprised her, telling him that he had nowhere else to go, that leaving now with a wound not yet fully healed and a bounty still on his head amounted to nothing more than choosing a slower way to die instead of a faster one, and that she had not saved his life in that barn only to watch him throw the remainder of it away out of some misplaced sense of obligation toward her safety. It was in the middle of this argument, both of them raising their voices in a barn that suddenly felt too small to hold everything being said in it, that Nathaniel asked her, with a bitterness that seemed aimed less at her than at his own circumstances, what exactly she thought staying would accomplish, given that he had no name Voss's influence hadn't already poisoned in 3 counties, no money, no prospects, and nothing to offer a woman like her beyond the certainty of more danger arriving, eventually at her door on his account. He said again, more sharply this time, that he had nowhere to go and no future worth asking anyone to share, and that she ought to stop pretending otherwise for both their sakes. Ruth stood very still when he said this, and then she said, in a voice that had lost all its earlier heat and gone instead very quiet and very certain, that he was wrong, that he did have somewhere to go, and it was here, in this barn and this house and this land, for as long as either of them needed it to be true, because she had watched him for 3 weeks mend fences and teach her brother and hold himself with more decency than most men she'd known who'd never had a bounty on their heads at all, and she was not interested in his assessment of his own worth when it contradicted everything she had witnessed with her own eyes. Nathaniel Cole did not have an answer ready for this, which told Ruth more than any answer could have. He looked at her for a long time in the lantern light, the same look she remembered from the night she'd dug the bullet from his side, and finally he said, roughly, that he didn't know how to want something he'd trained himself for 2 years not to want, because wanting a place, wanting a person, wanting anything at all beyond the next day's survival, was a luxury a hunted man couldn't afford to indulge without it being used against him eventually. Ruth told him that she understood something of that particular training herself, having spent 2 years since her father's death teaching herself not to want help she couldn't ask for and not to want a future she couldn't yet see clearly, and that perhaps the two of them, having both learned the same hard lesson separately, might be exactly suited to unlearning it together, if he was willing to try. They did not resolve everything that night, because some things are not resolved in a single conversation no matter how honestly it's conducted, but something shifted between them all the same, a loosening of the careful distance each had been keeping from the other, and over the following weeks that distance continued to close in small, undramatic ways. A hand that lingered a moment longer than necessary passing a plate at supper. A conversation that ran later into the evening than either had planned. A silence between them that had stopped feeling like the silence of strangers and started feeling like something closer to a companionship neither wanted to name yet for fear of jinxing it. The trouble Ruth had feared arrived, as trouble does, faster than either of them was ready for. Two of Voss's men rode onto her land on a gray afternoon in late autumn, ostensibly asking after stray cattle but plainly searching the property with a particular thoroughness of men paid to notice things, and Ruth met them in the yard with her rifle held loosely but visibly, answering their questions with the flat unhelpfulness of a woman who had lived alone long enough to know exactly how much information a stranger deserved, which was none at all. They left without finding anything. Nathaniel having gone to ground in a root cellar dug beneath the barn floor that he'd quietly excavated over the preceding week against exactly this possibility. But the visit made plain to both of them that the arrangement could not continue indefinitely, that Voss's suspicion had narrowed enough to include her ranch among the places worth checking, and that the next visit might not be so easily turned away. It was Daniel, of all people, who forced the issue toward its resolution, having grown fond enough of Nathaniel over the preceding weeks that he announced, with the blunt honesty of a 14-year-old, that he didn't see why Nathaniel couldn't just tell the truth to the sheriff instead of hiding forever like a man who actually had something to be ashamed of. Ruth had dismissed this as a boy's naive solution when Daniel first proposed it, but Nathaniel, turning the suggestion over for several days afterward, began to wonder aloud whether the boy hadn't stumbled onto something worth trying after all. Not blind faith that the law would simply believe him, but the possibility that Voss's crimes, if properly laid out with whatever evidence still existed, might carry more weight with a sheriff than Voss's money had thus far allowed. Ruth remembered then that her late father had kept careful ledgers of cattle counts and brand records for years as an informal check against exactly the kind of rustling operation Voss was known to run, and a careful search of her father's old papers turned up entries that, cross-referenced with dates Nathaniel could account for from his own memory, painted a clear enough picture of Voss's operation, systematically rebranding stolen cattle that even a sheriff inclined to look the other way for a wealthy man's sake might find it difficult to ignore once the evidence was laid plainly in front of him and witnesses in town. The confrontation that followed was not without danger. Nathaniel rode into town against Ruth's initial objections, the ledger pages folded inside his coat, and stood before the sheriff and, eventually, before a gathering crowd drawn by the commotion, laying out an account that Voss himself arrived to dispute loudly and with the particular outrage of a guilty man caught by surprise. But truth, once it has enough paper behind it, has a way of holding its ground even against louder voices, and the sheriff, presented with dates and brands and figures that didn't reconcile with Voss's own claimed records, found himself with rather less choice in the matter than Voss's money had previously afforded him. It took weeks rather than days to resolve fully, and Nathaniel spent an uncomfortable stretch of that time in a jail cell while the matter was investigated properly, but Ruth rode into town nearly every day of it, sitting outside his cell with whatever news or comfort she could bring, and when the charges against him were finally dropped and new ones filed instead against Everett Voss, it was Ruth standing outside the jailhouse door when Nathaniel Cole walked back out into daylight as a free man for the first time in 2 years. He stood in the street for a long moment, looking around him at a town that had, for once, not turned its back on him, and then he looked at Ruth, and he told her that he still didn't entirely know how to want a future, that the habit of expecting nothing had been carved into him deeply enough that he suspected it would take years rather than weeks to fully unlearn, but that he was willing to spend those years learning it beside her. If she'd still have him now that he had, technically speaking, even less to offer than he'd had hiding in her barn. No money, no land, nothing but a cleared name and whatever work he could find to build something from nothing all over again. Ruth told him that she had never once measured his worth by what he had to offer, only by what he had chosen to do with almost nothing when nothing was all he'd had, and that a man who mended fences and taught a boy to rope and held his tongue under a bounty rather than let fear turn him cruel was worth considerably more to her than any amount of money or land could account for on its own. They married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the same church where the town had gathered months earlier to watch Everett Voss's crimes laid bare, and Nathaniel took up work rebuilding what remained of the Callaway Ranch's herd, much of which had suffered from 2 years of Ruth managing it largely alone, while Daniel grew, under his patient tutelage, into precisely the kind of steady young rancher his father would have wanted him to become. The root cellar beneath the barn floor remained, unused for its original purpose, a quiet reminder between the two of them of exactly how close disaster had come to swallowing them both, and Ruth kept, tucked into the same drawer as her father's old ledgers, the folded pages that had once saved Nathaniel's life, not out of any need to relive the danger they represented but as a private testament to the fact that truth, patiently gathered and honestly presented, could outlast even a wealthy man's lies if enough people were willing to stand behind it. In the years that followed, when travelers passing through occasionally asked about the scar along Nathaniel's side or the story behind how the Callaway Ranch had come to have two names on its deed instead of one, Ruth would tell it plainly, the way she told everything, ending always with the same simple observation, that she had asked a wounded, hunted man one rainy night whether he had anywhere left to go, and he had told her no, and she had answered that now, whatever else was uncertain in either of their lives, he did. And that the answer had turned out to be truer, and to matter more than either of them could have guessed standing in that dark barn with rain hammering the roof and nothing certain ahead of them but each other.